It was May 1945. A Third Army prisoner of war processing center near Stuttgart, Germany, sat under a heavy shroud of dust and diesel exhaust. Hundreds of defeated German soldiers stood in a silent, defeated line, waiting to surrender their gear. Suddenly, a sharp argument broke the quiet drone of the camp. A captured officer stepped out of line, his chest thrust forward, loudly refusing to hand over the metal badges pinned to his tunic. He demanded an audience with a superior officer, blocking the path of 200 men behind him. He insisted that his decorations were personal property, protected by international law. George S. Patton, Jr. would soon show this man exactly what those medals were worth. This is the story of what happened when a captured Wehrmacht officer tried to dictate the terms of his own defeat, only to watch his military identity turn to slag. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when the loser still thinks he is the master. Lieutenant Maria Garcia was 25 years old, from El Paso, Texas, and assigned to the 3rd Army Processing Unit. She spoke English, Spanish, and basic German. Her brother had died on a beach in Normandy, a loss that left her with a quiet, unyielding determination to see her duties through to the end. Over the past 3 months, she had processed more than 3,000 prisoners of war. She had heard variations of the same arrogant complaints from hundreds of them, and her wooden crates already held 800 confiscated German medals destined for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force archives. She was thoroughly professional, unfailingly polite, and absolutely unmovable when it came to Army procedure. On this afternoon, her job brought her face to face with a man who refused to believe his world had ended. Major Karl Eichenberg was 39 years old, a seasoned Wehrmacht infantry officer from the mountains of Bavaria. He had spent 6 years fighting for the Reich, surviving the frozen horrors of Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and the Eastern Front. Pinned tightly to his clean, tailored gray tunic were the Iron Cross First Class, the German Cross in gold, the Eastern Front Medal, and the Wound Badge in silver. To Eichenberg, these medal shapes were not mere decorations. They were his personal honor, his identity, and the proof of his superiority over the soldiers who had captured him. He had spent years watching his unit execute civilians and partisans in the forests of Belarus, normalizing the brutality around him until he believed his uniform made him untouchable. He stood at the front of the processing line with polished boots and a lifted chin, convinced that his status as an officer exempted him from the humiliation of total surrender. By May 1945, the European theater was a vast landscape of ruins and moving armies. The German war machine had collapsed into absolute defeat, leaving millions of its soldiers wandering through the rubble of their shattered country. Allied forces faced the unprecedented logistical nightmare of rounding up, disarming, and processing these massive waves of prisoners. Chaos threatened every sector as broken supply lines, ruined roads, and displaced civilians clogged the towns and villages. In the face of this administrative overwhelm, many American units simply wanted to move the crowds through the gates as quickly as possible. Faced with massive numbers, some Allied officers had started letting small infractions slide. They turned a blind eye to German officers keeping their personal daggers, their polished dress boots, or the silver and iron medals pinned to their chests. It seemed like a harmless concession to keep the lines moving and avoid unnecessary friction with men who were already defeated. This leniency, however, only fed a dangerous illusion among the captive officer corps. Many of them began to believe that, while their government had fallen, their personal military honor and social standing remained entirely intact. They assumed the Americans would treat them as respected peers, rather than the instruments of a criminal regime. The standard processing line near Stuttgart was about to shatter that illusion completely. Lieutenant Garcia looked at the 4 medals on the major's chest and held out a brown paper envelope. "Please remove all decorations, insignia, and personal sidearms and place them in the container," she said. Major Eichenberg did not move his hands toward his tunic. "I am an officer of the Wehrmacht, and under the Geneva Convention, these are my personal effects," he said. Lieutenant Garcia did not lower the envelope. Standard procedure for this collection point requires the surrender of all military decorations. "Major, these medals were earned with blood on the Eastern Front," Eichenberg said, his voice rising so the prisoners behind him could hear. "They cannot be taken from me by an administrative clerk. They are my honor. Major, they are no longer your honor, Garcia answered. They are objects. Hand them over or be removed from the line. I refuse to surrender my soul to an army that does not respect the laws of combat, Eichenberg said. I demand to see your superior officer immediately. Lieutenant Garcia stepped back from the wooden table and signaled to the 2 military policemen standing near the wire gate. Major, you are delaying the processing of 200 men, she said. I will stand here until a proper American officer addresses a German officer with the appropriate respect, Eichenberg replied. The 2 military policemen grabbed Eichenberg by his elbows, pulling him firmly away from the processing table. The major kicked up dust with his polished boots, shouting back at the line of silent German prisoners. Do not give them your compliance, he yelled. They have no right to strip us of who we are. Lieutenant Garcia watched them drag the major toward a separate holding tent, then looked at the next prisoner in line. Next, she said. She walked immediately to the command tent and drafted a formal report detailing the major's active resistance and his attempt to incite the other prisoners. The report reached Patton within the hour. The general arrived within the hour. The low rumble of an open-top jeep signaled his entry into the compound, the vehicle kicking up a long plume of yellow dust as it stopped outside the headquarters tent. Patton stepped down onto the dirt. He wore his full-service uniform, the 4 silver stars on his helmet catching the harsh midday sun, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested quietly against his thighs. Every soldier in the courtyard snapped to attention, the sudden silence rippling through the processing lines until even the captive German officers stopped whispering. He did not say a word as he walked past them. He entered the office, took his seat behind the bare wooden desk, and looked up at the prisoner. Major Eichenberg stood before him, flanked by guards. He had refused to remove the decorations from his chest. Major Eichenberg, you have refused to surrender your medals at the processing point. Patton said, his voice deceptively quiet. Why? General, these decorations were earned in combat, Eichenberg answered, stepping forward. They are my personal honor. I will not surrender them. They are part of who I am. Major, who you were is no longer who you are. Patton said, you were a Wehrmacht officer in a war that you lost. You are now a prisoner of war in a country your army destroyed. The medals you wear represent actions taken in service of a regime that has been completely obliterated. They are not your honor. They are evidence. General, I refuse to accept this characterization, Eichenberg said, his face flush. I served Germany. I did not serve criminal enterprises. Major, you served on the Eastern Front, Patton countered, leaning forward slightly. You participated in anti-partisan operations. We have your unit's records right here on this desk. Your unit executed 47 suspected partisans in Belarus in October 1941. That number included 12 women and 8 children. The Eastern Front medal you wear on your chest was earned during that exact campaign. Do you wish to discuss what your medal commemorates? Eichenberg went stiff, his jaw tightening as he looked at the floor. Major, your medals will be confiscated, Patton continued. The question is whether they will be catalogued in an archive, or whether they will be destroyed today, in front of you, as a statement about what they actually represented. Your choice is simple: cooperate and surrender them for cataloging, or refuse and watch them be destroyed. I refuse, Eichenberg said. Praster Sergeant, please escort Major Eichenberg to the side table. Patton ordered. Major, please observe. The Master Sergeant escorted Eichenberg to the side table, where a small iron crucible sat over a glowing butane torch. Major, please remove your Iron Cross First Class and place it in the crucible, Patton said. Eichenberg stood frozen, his eyes locked straight ahead. The Master Sergeant reached forward, unpinning the iron medal from the gray tunic, gently but firmly, and dropped it into the small container. Patton held the blue flame steady against the iron. The metal began to discolor, turning deep blue and then a dull, angry red. The black enamel cracked and burned away into a foul-smelling smoke, and the white ribbon dissolved into gray ash. Major, this is iron, Patton said, watching the metal deform into an unrecognizable lump. It melts at 1538 degrees. Your Iron Cross is now scrap metal. It represents what it always represented: metal pressed into a shape that a dead regime considered meaningful. The meaning is gone. The metal remains. One by one, the sergeant stripped the remaining decorations. The German cross in gold, the Eastern Front medal, and the wound badge were all dropped into the intense heat. The other officers in the room stood in absolute silence, watching the proud badges melt down into a single glowing puddle of liquid slag. Eichenberg did not weep, but his skin turned a pale, chalky gray as 90 minutes of silent destruction reduced his military identity to a worthless liquid. Karl Eichenberg spent the remainder of his captivity as a nameless number in a standard prisoner camp. Stripped of the distinction he had fought so bitterly to maintain, he was finally released in 1948 and returned to his native Bavaria. He never wore another military decoration for the rest of his life, primarily because the originals had been reduced to ash and slag. He took a quiet job as a corporate accountant, living in absolute obscurity and never discussing his years on the Eastern Front with his neighbors or his family. He died in 1981. Following his funeral, his son discovered a small piece of folded paper hidden at the very back of his father's desk drawer. On it, the former major had written a single line: "The medal is in a museum. I have nothing left. I think I finally understand what I did." Lieutenant Maria Garcia returned to El Paso after her discharge, marrying a local schoolteacher and raising 3 children. She kept her wartime memories mostly to herself, though she lived a long, peaceful life until her passing in 2012. General Patton never included the Eichenberg incident in his official reports to Supreme Headquarters. He kept the paperwork filed away in the back of his personal field desk, away from the eyes of reporters and politicians. He only mentioned the confrontation once, in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. "I met a man who believed his medals made him a god," Patton wrote. "I proved to him they were just cheap iron." Some historians have argued that Patton's theatrical destruction of the major's medals was an unnecessary violation of a captive soldier's dignity, borderlining on a performative exercise in psychological cruelty. They suggest that such actions did little to change the broader realities of post-war Germany and violated the traditional professional respect usually afforded to surrendered officers. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that the eradication of these symbols was a vital step in breaking the stubborn arrogance of the Wehrmacht leadership. What is certain is that the puddle of melted metal from that crucible was cast into a small, plain disc and preserved as a stark historical testament to the total destruction of the regime. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply catalogued the medals according to the standard regulations? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when the loser still thinks he is the master, make sure to subscribe.